2016 NBA season is considered by some to be the greatest NBA season of all time. The Golden State Warriors went 73-9 as Steph Curry won the first ever unanimous MVP award, completely changing how the game was played along the way. Kobe Bryant played his final season and dropped 60 in his final game in the league, stunning the entire NBA world. The LeBron, Kyrie, Kevin Love Big Three Cavs dominated in the Eastern Conference, becoming one of the most iconic trios of the decade. The Warriors overcame a 3-1 deficit in a brutal series versus the Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook Thunder, where Klay Thompson had a legendary Game 6 that earned him his nickname, aptly, of Game 6 Klay. And of course, the Cleveland Cavaliers battled back from down 3-1 in the finals, becoming the first team to win it all after facing such a deficit, with the series wrapping up in a legendary Game 7 that still to this day is probably the best basketball game I've ever seen, and one of the greatest in the history of the sport itself. The block from LeBron, the shot from Kyrie, Draymond going off for 30 randomly, and of course the Cleveland Cavaliers lifting their first Larry O'Brien trophy in franchise history after losing the year prior. It was an incredible year for the sport and one that was foundational for me as a basketball fan. But along the way through all of that, it feels like one squad from that season, a very important part of everything that happened that year, kind of gets forgotten about. And it wasn't just any team, it was a historically great team that dominated the NBA nearly to the level of the record-setting Golden State Warriors from the same season. That team was the San Antonio Spurs. Heading into the 2015-16 season, the Spurs had been pretty disappointing the year prior. They got knocked out in the first round by the Lob City Clippers after winning 55 games in the regular season, a ridiculous mark that was somehow only good enough to get the 6th seed in the most stacked Western Conference, or at least one of them, that we've seen in a very long time. And the series with the Clippers was very hard fought. It took a miraculous Chris Paul game winner to knock them off in the final seconds of that Game 7, but the Spurs had championship aspirations. They were just coming off a finals victory where Kawhi Leonard won finals MVP and had just been anointed as Defensive Player of the Year. They had an aging but still very effective trio of Tony Parker, Tim Duncan, and Manu Ginobili, a solid supporting cast of guys like Danny Green, Marco Bellinelli, Patty Mills, and Boris Diaw amongst others. They were top 10 offense, top 10 defense. Kawhi had become one of the best in the world. They were really good and they wanted to go ahead and repeat as champions, and in most Western conferences they probably would have at least made the second round if not the conference finals, but this conference was completely stacked, and to compete with the best of the best in that West, they needed to be a bit better. Luckily for them, in that offseason they did a phenomenal job of not just retaining their core pieces but also bringing in new talent that really complemented the existing cast. They retained key guys like Matt Bonner, Danny Green, Tim Duncan, and Manu, while also signing their rising superstar Kawhi Leonard to a 5-year extension, which was supposed to keep Kawhi Leonard in San Antonio for the long term, although we know how that went in the 2019 offseason when he became a Toronto Raptor. They also brought on guys like Jonathan Simmons, who gave the Spurs some fun moments, Boban Marjanovic, who came into place of backup big, David West, who also did that in a similar role. Most importantly though, they added a new all-star to the rotation in LaMarcus Aldridge, luring him away from the Portland Trailblazers where he had played his entire career up to that point, signing him to a 4-year, $90 million deal, and winning the sweepstakes over really competitive teams that were also vying for his services, like the Rockets, the Mavericks, the Lakers, and the Miami Heat. LaMarcus was an incredible addition to this team. He was just coming off his 4th straight All-Star appearance with Portland and had averaged 23.4 points per game, 10.2 rebounds, and 1.7 assists on a Portland team that made the playoffs, although they lost in the first round, to the really tough grit and grind Grizzlies. He gave San Antonio a big-time scoring punch in the front court that they needed, as Kawhi Leonard had led them in scoring the previous year with just 16.5 points per game. Now, of course, a big reason for this was the Spurs' ball movement heavy offense that basically said we don't care who gets the shot as long as it's open, but it does make sense to have at least a couple of star scorers that are basically always going to be ready to go if the other guys on the roster aren't hitting their shots, because role players are a bit more hit or miss than all-star players like Aldridge was. So heading into the season, the Spurs had taken a 55-win team from the year prior that was top 10 offensively and defensively and added solid role players, a high-level scoring all-star in LaMarcus Aldridge, and they seem bound to get at least a small leap from Kawhi Leonard in the upcoming season. This resulted in them being considered one of the favorites to win it all. Heading into the year, they had the 5th best championship odds, only behind the Los Angeles Clippers, the Oklahoma City Thunder, the Golden State Warriors, and the Cleveland Cavaliers. It seemed pretty certain that the Spurs, at the very least, would be up there amongst the West's elite and put together a pretty good season, but What a lot of people didn't expect is the fact that they would have a historically dominant season, one of the best we have ever seen. Funnily enough, this team actually struggled in the preseason. There was one Bleacher Report article that I was reading to get some context on people's thoughts about the squad heading into the season, and he commented how the Spurs offense looked disastrous in the preseason, that it was a bit of an area of concern. That wouldn't end up being a problem, I can promise you that. But I will say that in their first game of the season, they lost. They lost the Oklahoma City Thunder by 6 on the road due to a 55 combined points from Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant. Aldridge had a bit of a tough debut. Kawhi went crazy with 32 points, 8 boards, 3 steals, and 2 blocks. It wasn't the best opener from San Antonio, but following this, losses would become pretty rare for this team because over the next month, the Spurs went 14-3 heading into December with a record of 14-4, the best in the entire NBA, only second to the then 19-0 Golden State Warriors because of course they were 19-0 at that point. This would pretty much be how the entire season would go for the Western Conference. The Golden State Warriors would rack up win after win after win as they tried to inch closer to eclipsing that 72 win mark set by the Chicago Bulls back in 1996. But the Spurs were never too far behind, continuously lurking in the background, racking up ridiculous win totals themselves while playing some of the best basketball in the entire NBA. One of these such stretches occurred from the beginning of December to January 22nd, when San Antonio would go on a ridiculous stretch of 24 wins and just 2 losses, including a 13-game win streak where the Spurs won by an average of 18 points per game. Not only were they beating everyone, but they were blowing opposing teams out of the water, especially at home, where at this point we're at right now in the season, they were 24-0. Additionally, 16 of their wins at this point were by 20 plus points, the most such wins through 44 games in NBA history. They were dominating on both ends, locking up defensively behind the play of Kawhi Leonard, who was again a Defensive Player of the Year frontrunner, Tim Duncan, who was still somehow playing incredible defense at 39 years old. Still to this day, it is a tragedy that Tim Duncan never won a Defensive Player of the Year. He is one of the best defenders of all time. That award was one that he should have won at least a couple of times, in my opinion. I can't believe he never won one. And again in this season, despite being pretty much on the verge of retirement, Timmy D was still one of the best rim protectors in the league. Danny Green was clamping up on the wing. Tony Parker was playing some good defense at the guard spot. They were basically locking down anyone and everyone on basically every night. Meanwhile, offensively, they were again a top 10 unit, but this time, rather than hanging around the 7 to 8 spot, they were fighting for a top 5 spot, with Kawhi Leonard jumping to a 20-point per game score, and LaMarcus Aldridge's offensive punch coming in huge for them, both hitting mid-range jumpers as well as banging down low in the paint to score near 20 points per game himself. On January 25th, the Golden State Warriors and San Antonio Spurs faced off for the first time that season, with the Warriors sitting at 40-4, chasing that 96 Bulls record, seemingly with a path to do so in sight, while the Spurs themselves were 38-6, coming off that 13-game win streak, just 2 games behind the Dubs at this point, with a chance to cut that deficit to 1 if they got a win here. I remember how incredibly anticipated this matchup was. I found a full Bleacher Report article breaking down every aspect of these two teams battling because it's probably one of the best record matchups we have seen in the entirety of NBA history. Again, the Warriors were seemingly on a path to 73-9 or better, and the Spurs were just 2 games back. It was a momentous occasion for the season. Now, unfortunately, this game was over pretty early. The Dubs jumped out to a 15-point lead at halftime behind a usual Steph Curry dominant performance from that season. The Spurs were unable to really slow down their offense, and Golden State ended up winning by 30 after a typical Warriors third quarter explosion, which led to pretty much all the starters on both sides sitting in the fourth quarter. It didn't live up to the hype. Tim Duncan didn't play in this one, and he certainly would have helped their defense, although I don't think he's stopping a 30-point blowout. Golden State was just the better team on this night and got this big win that would help them put a little bit of space between the Spurs, but it still wasn't much. It was unfortunate for the Spurs that they missed this chance to gain a bit of ground on the Warriors, but following the loss, they would stick with what they were doing prior and go on another dominant streak, winning 21 of their next 25 games, including a win over the Warriors themselves, where they held Golden State to just 79 points, unanimous MVP, and that Golden State Warriors offense, they held them to 79 points. That was their lowest total on the season by 10 points. It was an absurd defensive effort as they handed the Warriors one of their 9 losses on the entire year. Kawhi Leonard and LaMarcus Aldridge both ended up being named All-Stars. The Spurs headed into the final month of the season with a record of 59-10, just 3 games back of the Warriors, who they would play twice more in the season. And because they were so close and got a chance to play them towards the end of the year, despite eventually going 73-9, the Warriors did not officially lock up the 1 seed until the final week of the season. That's incredible. For reference, the 72-10 Bulls locked up the 1 seed with about a month left and eventually would beat out the 2-seeded Magic by 12 games. The Golden State Warriors set the best record in NBA history, but were still playing all their starters consistently, not only because they wanted to chase the record, but because they had to, or else the Spurs could catch up with them and take the 1 seed. For a while, people were actively wondering, are we going to see 2 separate teams win 70+ games, something that up to this point had only happened once in NBA history with the Bulls, in not just the same year, but in the same conference. Now, obviously, the Spurs wouldn't quite get there. They lost 3 straight games towards the end of the season, 2 of those losses coming to the Golden State Warriors, who, again, they played twice to kind of round out the year. They would finish with a couple of wins and wrap up the year with a record of 67-15, somehow only good enough for second in the West. Obviously, from this full season breakdown and the record itself, you can probably tell that the Spurs were pretty good. But if we dive into the numbers, we can see just how historically great this team was. And this is why I wanted to make this video, because you can take a look at the record, the fact that they did so in a stacked Western Conference, and understand that, yeah, this team is pretty good, but they were historically great. The numbers back them up as one of the greatest teams in NBA history. Going back to the standings, their record of 67-15 is tied for the 7th best record in league history and is tied for the 2nd best record of the 2000s with the 2015 and 2017 Warriors, as well as the 2007 Dallas Mavericks. On the road, the Spurs went 27-14, the 2nd best mark in the NBA that season, but at home, they finished with a record of 40-1. Yes, they won 40 games at home and lost just a single matchup when they were playing in San Antonio, tying for the best single-season home record of all time with the 85-86 Boston Celtics. If we put this into a percentage, they won 97.6% of their home games, which doesn't even feel possible. If you went to a Spurs home game, you picked one at random, there was a 98% chance that you were going to witness them win. The only time they lost an entire year was in that 3-game losing streak at the end of the season, where they lost to the Golden State Warriors by 6 points. Only the 73-9 Warriors were able to prevent the Spurs from going perfect on the year at home. Offensively, they finished with the 4th best rating in the NBA that season, behind the Golden State Warriors, the Thunder, the Cavs, as well as tying with the Toronto Raptors. So they were great on that end. You know, Kawhi Leonard, of course, like I mentioned, was averaging 20 points per game. The playmaking of Manu Ginobili off the bench, Tony Parker, the great offense of LaMarcus Aldridge, a cast of role players who were able to consistently contribute. It was a really good offensive squad, but defensively is really where they made their mark on the record books. This season, defensively, they finished with a rating of 98.2, which was not only the best in the league, but it was the best in the league by a margin of 2.6 points, which is ridiculous. For perspective, this past season, the Cleveland Cavaliers had the best defense in the league and were just 0.7 points ahead of the 2nd spot Celtics. I went all the way back to the 1996-97 season, which is as far back as NBA.com's advanced stats were letting me go, and there wasn't a single other instance of a team finishing this far ahead of the 2nd place squad in defensive rating. If we take a look at their defense from a strict opponent's point per game perspective, they held opposing teams to just 92.9 points per game that season, a full 3 points better than any other squad. Again, I went back to 96-97, and only one other time did this happen, and it was the Cleveland Cavaliers in 97, who were 3.3 opposing points per game, better than the competition. So they were the 2nd team to have that type of margin in the last 27 years, and they were the only team in that range to have a defensive rating that was that much better than the competition. They were just on a complete other planet this season defensively. It resulted in Kawhi winning Defensive Player of the Year for the 2nd year in a row, as he also secured 2nd MVP voting, although he was behind unanimous MVP Steph Curry, so that doesn't mean too much. When you have a team that was top 5 in offense and also a historically great defense, you'd probably expect their net rating to be pretty good, which is exactly the case. They finished this season with a net rating of 11.3, which was not only the highest net rating that season, yes, they eclipsed the 73-9 Golden State Warriors in net rating, but it is the 4th best net rating by any team ever in a single season. It's only behind the 96 and 97 Bulls, as well as the 2017 Warriors, all of which are considered some of the greatest teams of all time. If you ask people what's the best team in NBA history, most people are going to say either those Bulls teams or that Warrior squad. The San Antonio Spurs are right there behind them in net rating in a single season. And perhaps the craziest part is it wasn't like there was some super team with 3 All-Stars. They were, of course, led by Kawhi Leonard, who had become one of the better players in the world at that point. He averaged 21.2 points per game, 6.8 rebounds, 2.6 assists, 1.8 steals, 1 block, on 50.6 field goal percentage, 44.3% from 3, and 87.4% from the line. So yeah, he was a 20-point per game scoring, near 50-40-90 guy that played decoy defense. He was ridiculous, and Aldridge was also really good with 18 points per game, 8.5 rebounds, 1.5 dimes, 1.1 blocks on 51.3% shooting from the field, who also was holding his own defensively. Like, those guys were great, but outside of them, it was just overall great team play. You had 33-year-old Tony Parker putting up 11.9 points per game and 5.3 assists, 38-year-old Manu dropping 9.6 points per game off the bench and 3.1 assists, Tim Duncan at 39 years old, again, being one of the more impactful rim protectors and overall defenders in the league, adding 8.6 points per game, 7.3 rebounds, and 2.3 assists a night. Patty Mills and Danny Green each contributed about 8.5 points per game and a couple of dimes. David West added 7 points and 4 boards. Boris Diaw put up 6 points and 3 boards. Kevin Martin, Jonathan Simmons, and Boban all added between 5.5 and 6 points per game. It was a team that was led by 2 All-Stars, but just played incredible team basketball, which is a mantra that's really synonymous with all of those mid-2010 Spurs teams. But this season in particular, I feel like gets forgotten when we talk about some of the greatest Spurs squads of all time, teams that played amazing team ball while still having incredible stars like Kawhi Leonard, like LaMarcus Aldridge. They locked up defensively. They had, again, one of the best net ratings of all time. They were, of course, being orchestrated by, in my opinion, the greatest coach of all time in Greg Popovich. It was just an unbelievable team. Watching them chase the Warriors while establishing greatness in their own right all season was ridiculously fun, and it set up a potential matchup between Titans in that year's Western Conference Finals between Golden State and San Antonio, although it wouldn't be a matchup that we would end up seeing. In the first round of the playoffs, the Spurs matched up with a pretty beat-up Memphis Grizzlies squad who they swept in pretty dominant fashion. Memphis was missing Mike Conley, as well as Marc Gasol, and were led in scoring by Zach Randolph, Lance Stevenson, and a 39-year-old Vince Carter, so they didn't stand much of a chance. The Grizzlies lost game 1 by 32, lost game 2 by 26, were held to just 68 points in that game, lost game 3 by 9, and the sweep was finished with a 21-point victory for San Antonio. Meanwhile, on the other side of the bracket, the Oklahoma City Thunder, led by Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant, who the Spurs lost to in Game 1 of the season, were also taking care of business, defeating the Mavericks in a pretty dominant fashion in 5 games. I can tell you, as a diehard Thunder fan, this series had me worried. Like, I was optimistic, obviously, and believed that we could win this because we had KD, we had Russ, Ibaka, Steven Adams. We were finally fully healthy with all of our stars good to go. We had a good supporting cast. Like, I certainly believed in the team, but this Spurs squad was terrifying, and they flexed their muscles in the first game, dominating, winning by 32 points at home, led by 38 points from LaMarcus Aldridge, who has just always been a guy who has terrorized the Oklahoma City Thunder. Like, I have nightmares about some of the things that LaMarcus did to OKC throughout that late mid-2010s era. He was a monster. Not only did he have 38 in this game, but he would pretty much destroy us most of this series. He set his career high a few years later. I think it was in 2019 against us, where he had, I think it was 56 points. LaMarcus is one of those guys. Every franchise has a couple of players that just destroy them, and for a while, that guy for us was LaMarcus Aldridge. In my opinion, truly one of the most underappreciated stars of that 2010s era. And he would again terrorize us in Game 2, putting up 41 points, but we managed to bounce back, getting out of San Antonio with a 1-point win in Game 2, stealing home court advantage away. Some of you may remember this was an incredibly controversial game, specifically in the final 15 seconds. We had the ball inbounding it up 1 with 13.5 seconds to go. Dion Waiters was inbounding it, being guarded by Manu Ginobili, and Dion couldn't seem to get the ball in. Now, part of this was because Manu Ginobili was stepping over the out-of-bounds line, which isn't allowed, but then I'll admit Dion Waiters threw an elbow a little bit into the chest of Manu Ginobili, pushing him away, which is definitely not allowed. He managed to inbound the ball to Kevin Durant, who brought it down and got stripped by Danny Green, giving the Spurs a quick fast break. He kicked it ahead to Patty Mills, who got it to Ginobili, who drove and kicked it out on a kind of over-the-head, behind-the-back pass to Patty Mills in the corner, who ended up missing the 3 due to a Steven Adams contest. Aldridge grabs the board. Adams tries to get back into the play after flying into the crowd. Fans grab his leg so he can't get back in. The ball gets knocked out of Aldridge's hands. It's loose on the ground. Ibaka grabs it, falls over. Time expires. The Thunder win. It was completely hectic. People were freaking out. Like I said, there was a lot of controversy. I think a last 2 minutes report came out after that, and there was like a billion missed calls on both sides. It was ridiculous, but in the end, the Thunder did end up getting the win officially, sending the series back to Oklahoma City tied 1-1. But Game 3 saw the Spurs bounce back and win in OKC behind 74 combined points from LaMarcus, Kawhi, and Tony Parker, before the Thunder took Game 4 by 14 as Kevin Durant torched the Spurs for 41 points on 56% shooting, despite being primarily guarded by Defensive Player of the Year Kawhi Leonard. And that is one thing I want to give Kevin Durant a lot of credit for in this series. Kawhi played some incredible defense, but a lot of times it just didn't matter. KD was kind of on a mission in this one, and he was a big reason why the Thunder were able to stay so competitive throughout most of these games. But in Game 5, it was Russ's turn as he put up a 35-point, 11-rebound, 9-assist performance to lead the Thunder to a 4-point win, putting them a game away from the Western Conference Finals. As the series progressed, I think one of the biggest factors to why the Spurs kind of underperformed here is that the age of some of their key players really caught up with them. Their defense struggled to keep up with the Thunder's top 5 offense. Fast-moving guys like Russell Westbrook in the fast break or even in the half court when he was trying to attack the rim and dunk on you. His playmaking was incredible, kind of slicing them up. Kevin Durant hitting shots. The Spurs just really weren't able to keep up with an incredibly high-powered Thunder offense at that moment. And in Game 6, this all came to a head as Oklahoma City blew them out, going up by 24 at halftime and leading by as much as 28 during the game. The Spurs would end up cutting the deficit to 14 points by the end, but ultimately fell in the second round to the Oklahoma City Thunder, who would end up surely going on to defeat the Golden State Warriors after going up 3-1. Let me pretend that actually happened. It was a disappointing end for a San Antonio Spurs team that really dominated in every sense of the word during the regular season. They made a statement against the Grizzlies, did so again in Game 1 against the Thunder, but ultimately age really came into play and they just weren't able to keep up with OKC's 2 superstars. This game would actually end up being the final game from Tim Duncan, who quietly retired following the loss, opting to not go for a retirement tour in typical reserved Tim Duncan fashion. The Spurs would end up making the Western Conference Finals the following season with a pretty similar core, but would lose to the Kevin Durant Warriors after Kawhi suffered an ankle injury at the hands of Zaza Pachulia, or I guess the foot in the landing space of Kawhi Leonard of Zaza Pachulia, an injury that would ultimately kind of end up leading to his exit from San Antonio not too long afterwards. And although that 2015-16 Spurs team didn't go on to win a title or battle the Warriors in the conference finals, to this day, this Spurs team remains one of my favorite teams to watch, and in my opinion, the most underrated team maybe in NBA history. They were a juggernaut. They dominated with team play, elite defense, 2 really fun all-stars to watch, including a rising superstar in Kawhi Leonard. They gave the greatest regular season team of all time a fight in the standings all year. You saw Kawhi Leonard at a depoy level for the final time, the final season of Tim Duncan, who again somehow remained a force till the very end. An all-star season from LaMarcus Aldridge, who again, in my opinion, is one of the most underappreciated stars of the 2010s. Of course, contributions from the old big 3 of Tony Parker, Manu, Tim Duncan, Greg Popovich, of course, in the fold as well. They just played incredible team basketball. Again, they went 40-1 at home and helped make 2016 one of the best seasons of all time. You had all that stuff I mentioned at the beginning with the Golden State Warriors, the series between them and the Thunder, Game 6 Clay, the Cavaliers, what they did in the NBA Finals, Kobe Bryant's final game. You had all these amazing moments, but this 67-win Spurs team that partially rewrote some of the history books deserves to be mentioned with some of those greatest teams that we've seen in the modern era, some of those great moments of an incredible 2016 season. They deserve their flowers. I tweeted about this team today as I'm recording this video before I did so, and I talked about how they're underappreciated. I tweeted out that they were 41 at home, the incredible defense, Kawhi Leonard's play, and I basically said that they were one of the most forgotten NBA juggernauts really of all time. And a lot of people were like, yeah, I remember this team, they were super fun to watch, and also gave them their flowers. But there was a good number of people that said that, oh, they deserve to be forgotten because they lost in the second round, they didn't win a title, what did they do in the playoffs, this and that. I don't like that way of looking at hoops. If we discounted every team that ever lost in a second round or didn't win the finals, we would miss out on remembering so many great squads. In my opinion, it's way more fun to reminisce on these teams and talk about their dominance, even if it didn't end the way that it was supposed to in their vision. Me personally, I'll always remember this Spurs team and appreciate what they brought to the game in this season, the fear that they gave me as a Thunder fan, and overall the dominance that they showed that entire season as one of the most forgotten and underappreciated juggernauts in NBA history. With all that being said, I appreciate y'all watching. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of these videos. I want to make more content like this, breaking down old teams or, individual seasons from players as the offseason progresses. I've already written down a full list of some videos I want to make. There's one about Isaiah Thomas's MVP 5th place finish season coming up soon. I want to make one about Wizards John Wall, particularly in like that 2016 to 2018 era where he was in conversations for one of the best point guards in the league. I think I want to make one like Indiana Paul George, even maybe OKC Paul George the year that he finished top 3 in MVP and Defensive Player of the Year voting. There's some other teams and players on that list. Those are just the ones off the top of my head. But if there's any others that you want to see, go ahead and comment them down below. I'd love to hear y'all suggestions. I'm sure there are some teams that I'm underappreciating that you really want to see me talk about, and maybe by kind of getting my memory jogged from your comment, I'll remember how great they were and end up making a video about them. If I see one of your comments and I use your idea, I'll definitely make sure to credit you in the video. There's also, like always, a Google form that's down there for video suggestions if you ever want to use that too. But yeah, I appreciate y'all watching. Again, I'll see y'all later. Everyone say it back.